Выйду ночью в поле с конем, ночкой темной тихо пойдем, мы пойдем с конем по полю вдвоем, мы пойдем с конем по полю вдвоем, мы пойдем.
Hello, and you are listening to an episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am going to be the host for today, just me, but I am joined much more importantly by my colleague Lydia. Lydia, how
Hello,
are you?
everyone. Hello, everyone. I started talking early because I was too excited.
Well, it is quite an exciting episode for all of our listeners today because we're going to be talking about the best time to be alive if you were to listen to Russian mainstream media. Freudian slip there. Western mainstream media. The 1990s in Russia, and what a joy it was to at last be free before all of that democracy and freedom and potential was crushed by the evil dictator Putin. I'm joking, of course. It was an absolutely awful time to be alive. As a matter of fact, one of the worst times to be alive in modern Russian history. But we'll be getting to that presently, because Lydia here actually has some memories from that time. And Lydia, I think you wanted to start us off in a particular way to set the scene.
Yes, because obviously when the 90s happened, I was pretty young. Yes, contrary to popular belief, I'm not that old. But on a more serious note, before we started this and while I was getting ready for the podcast, I talked to my mom because she was obviously an adult. And in my life, I've worked with veterans of the Great Patriotic War. And something interesting that I didn't think about before I started working with them is that actually a lot of them don't particularly like talking about the war. They usually have their story because obviously they have had to talk about their experience for quite a while, but of quite a few times in their life. But usually if you start asking them some more personal questions, they don't particularly like that because it's difficult. And something that was surprising to me in a way is that it was the same way for my mom when I started asking her questions about the 90s. Because definitely it was a very traumatic experience for, I would say, most Russians. And when last year, when the SMO started, I think that a lot of people from outside of the country didn't realize maybe is that the initial fear that the Russians felt when we were hit by the sanctions was not even the fear of a war or anything like that. It was the fear of going back to the same time, to the time when Russia was very unstable, to the time where things were hopeless, to the time where you couldn't plan things because you actually didn't know what was going to happen the next day.
So, you wanted to tell us a bit about the time just before the Soviet Union went ploof to set the scene for plunging into that catastrophe.
Well, what's interesting is that my very first memory, or I should say memories, are from the Soviet Union. And actually, a lot of the time people like to ask me, especially my foreign friends, what were the 90s like, or what was it like when Russia became the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And the way I like to think about it, when I think about my childhood and I think about the Soviet Union, everything was just gray and beige and calm and kind of peaceful and empty because the stores were kind of empty during that time. And it was just like a very still lake. Not much was happening for me as a child, at least. And so just picture this world where there is not a lot of color. There is not a whole lot going on. Everything is just just very calm. And I remember, because, well, I'm kind of, moving forward a little bit because we're going to talk about that. But I remember my very first memory when I realized that in some way, in some grand way, my life as a Soviet child was over. Is I remember I was on my way somewhere with my mom, and we were in one of those underground passages. And one of the signs of the times in the 90s, as probably a lot of our listeners know, is there was a lot of there were not there were obviously stores, but not the stores in the sense as we know them today. There were little kiosks. There were little stores, little shops with things. And so we were in one of those underground passages, and I saw something that I had never seen before. It was a small kiosk, and it was full of chocolate and candy and gum, and it was so bright. It was Snickers and Bounty and all of those Western things, Western candy. And it looked so wild to me because it was probably one of the brightest things that I'd seen in my life, and it looked so exciting, but also at the same time so foreign and out of place there. And so to me, that is kind of one of my first memories, and how I even without understanding it really realized back then as a child that something has changed in my country, and that things were never actually going to be the same.
Okay. The way we are going to progress the rest of this episode is that I am going to provide, as my little old self, a little bit of a brief overview of a year and what happened in it. And Lydia is going to tell us a bit about what she or people she knows remember of that year. And we're going to start with the first year, 1992. But perhaps reflecting the fact that nothing was really planned, nothing really seemed to have a plan. As a matter of fact, part of the whole conceit of Yeltsin and the coterie of liberals around him who took power as the Soviet Union finally fell apart in its final months and took over in the new Russian Federation, formally, officially, and completely at the very end of 1991, was a contempt for the idea of a plan. Indeed, the conceit was Russia had gotten into such difficulties by adhering to all of those 5-year plans. And the government had intervened too much in the economy, tried to do too much. The point was to leave things to the market. So therefore, immediately here, even though actually the transition to a market economy, as someone who was then advising them in the first few months of 1992, Jeffrey Sachs would say, the transition from either or, from a planned economy to a market economy, or back from a market economy to a planned economy, requires very intensive planning and actually a lot of action by the government, because one way or the other, the government fundamentally shapes, being the ultimate enforcer, what an economy looks like, even if that's a market economy, just simply because the government sets the laws and is the ultimate arbiter. However, the first act on 6 January 1992, or that's when it came into effect because the decision had been made in late 1991, was by Yeltsin's first prime minister and economy minister Yegor Gaidar to free prices in the stores, except for bread. But the price on controls on bread were lifted in June 1992. So, even though, so the store shelves are bare. For the moment, all of the normal grocery shops are still state-owned by this point in January 1992. The idea is that because there are shortages, if you let the market set prices, you will undercut the black market, because then farmers can sell their produce at the prices they want through legitimate channels, which will put goods back on the shelves. This will result in price rises, but rising prices, i.e. people able to sell food or food goods for higher prices in Russia will also encourage imports of those same products because people want to get that higher price, which will fill out the shelves and end shortages and also stop creating distortions in this market. We don't have time to get into how it was that shortages in the Soviet Union developed. Suffice it to say that one of the paradoxes of the Soviet Union was that in 1990, the Soviet Union had a very good harvest, but shortages got worse. How it quite got to be that way is beyond the scope of this podcast, but there it was. So Gaidar was trying to, he said, solve this problem. He also said that because of the breakdown in the state supply system, that in terms of food reserves that the government had access to, they had access to 6 weeks worth of food, and that if he didn't do something to alleviate this, people would begin to starve. So his solution to this was to free prices, because this would solve everything. Lydia, what do you remember of January 1992 or 1992 in general and the freeing of prices and what happened in the store? Did the boom in the provision of consumer goods and food that Gaidar predicted actually happen?
Well, let's put it this way. Did it happen? Yes, it did happen because, like I said before, the problem was that we didn't have a lot of things in the store, at least in the area where I lived. That was actually a big problem. Then we were faced with a different problem. There were goods on the shelves, but people couldn't afford them, at least the majority, because and I feel like a lot of our listeners in the West will be able to relate somewhat because of the inflation. But just imagine that some things would become 20 times more expensive, because it did happen to some of the things. And of course, naturally, back then I didn't realize that because I was not an adult. But what's actually funny in a way, now that I think about it, is food wise, in some ways, it didn't change much for me because before our diet was kind of, didn't have a lot of variety because there wasn't a lot of variety. And then our diet didn't have a lot of variety just because we couldn't afford having a lot of variety. And back then, I remember my parents obviously being very stressed. And I remember most people, as we do in Russia, we have our dacha, which is basically your little piece of land with a summer house where you grow things. And a lot of the people were really struggling and were able to survive. That's a dramatic word, but it's actually not an exaggeration. They were able to survive because they had some potatoes in storage, they had some carrots in storage, and they had some canned goods, and sometimes they would exchange things with their neighbors. That's also something that I remember. But basically, it was just it was a very difficult time. The whole shock therapy, because I have listened to quite a few podcasts with Professor Sachs, and I remember, this is gonna get a little bit emotional for me, I guess, but I remember listening to one of his podcasts, and where he was explaining the system and the so-called shock therapy that was prescribed to us by our government, and I guess you could say the West, because they were willing to help us become more democratic. And he said in one of the podcasts that essentially what was done to Russia and the Russian people during that time, the result of it could be described as economic genocide. And I remember listening to that, and actually I started crying because that's exactly what it felt like, even though I was little back then. But just the circumstances that the people were put in were impossible.
Um, It's so interesting to me that you describe going on your dacha and potatoes. Now, I'm going to be reading at length here a bit from this book called The Godfather of the Kremlin by an American journalist named Pavel Khlebnikov. So, this is what he writes of shock therapy, or the effects that you are describing. I knew what was going on with my grain supplies, Gaidar says. I knew how many rail cars of grain I had, how many reserves I had. I knew that at best, assuming complete freedom of movement and lowered consumption rates, we had enough grain to last us until the middle of February. Starving to death and freezing in winter, the two great phantoms of the Russian imagination. Perhaps Gaidar could not be blamed for panicking. There is no time for discussions, he remembers thinking. People will begin to die of hunger. Gaidar knew that freeing prices would unleash hyperinflation, but on 2 January 1992, all prices save for those of a few strategic goods were freed, and they immediately skyrocketed. Shopkeepers scrambled to add zeros to price tags. Shoppers wandered around in a daze. By the end of the year, the price of eggs had increased 1,900%, soap 3,100%, tobacco 3,000 to 600%, bread 4,300%, milk 4,800%. Savings accounts, meanwhile, yielded only a few percent interest, and salaries increased only slightly. The great mass of savings accumulated by Russians over generations was wiped out. Gaidar's shock therapy, as the wags would soon note, was all shock and no therapy. Russia's gross domestic product plummeted 19% in 1992, another 9% in 1993, a further 13% in 1994, and so on for most of the 1990s. By the end, a huge superpower had been reduced to the status of an impoverished third world country. Now, reviewing the same policy a few pages later, this is also what Khlebnikov concludes about this. With Russia in a slump far worse than the Great Depression, i.e., the U.S. Great Depression, people tapped an old survival instinct. Amid rumors of crop failure and impending food shortages, millions of city dwellers traveled to the countryside to plant cabbages and potatoes in their garden plots. The arable land just outside Moscow was swarming with people digging and planting. It was back to medieval agriculture. Chubais and Gaidar were proud of the fact that mass starvation had been avoided. But it was avoided not because prices had been liberalized, but because the Russian people had returned to the countryside. It was with a shovel and a sack of seed potatoes that Russians escaped starving in 1992 and 1993.
That's actually very accurate, and I can also tell you something that in the fall, when after people gather their crops and potatoes and carrots, and usually how it works is that you can't put your vegetables into storage right away. You have to kind of spread them out in the sun so they get dry, and you sort through them, see if some are rotten, or if the rats or the mice or whomever got to them. And then after that you put them into storage, and actually you would see people going through, obviously, through the garbage. You would see people going through the whatever vegetables people threw out before they put them into storage, because people were literally looking for food, searching for food. And something that people need to understand, because some will say, well, poverty exists everywhere, which is true. Homelessness exists in most places, and poverty exists in most places. But you have to understand that these were people who just a couple of years ago had stable jobs, had had their lives figured out. Everything was good. And like I always like to describe the 90s in that sense. Also, another thing that's very characteristic for that time is what we call in Russian spontaneous markets, meaning that people would actually go through their belongings and pick anything that could be of value, and it could be like even metals or paintings, anything, books and clothes, and they would stand in the streets and they would try selling them, uh because they couldn't really, they were looking for ways to make money. And the whole, while I was listening to the whole freeing the prices, freeing the market, I actually have a perfect analogy for this. Something that people can criticize the Soviet Union and the system, and this is, like you said, a topic for a different time. But something that can be said for the Soviet Union is that people, from the moment they were born until the moment they died, had a purpose and had a very clear vision of what they would be doing with their lives. They knew that they would go to school, they knew that they would have a job, they knew that they would have a place to live, they knew, what kind of salary they could hope to get. So they knew that they would have certain social benefits and all of those things. And the best way how I can describe it is that I have a cat, and if my cat, who's very much loved and has never been outside except for for some visits to the vet, even though she is very much an adult predator, if I let her outside right now, she will not know what to do with that kind of freedom. And I can tell her, go, be free, hunt, but she's not going to do that. What she's going to do is be terrified, and she's going to become an easy prey, uh, for someone. And so that's actually what happened to a lot of people, because when we talk about freeing the prices and freedom and democracy and the market economy, you have to understand that those were people who didn't know how those things work, not because they were stupid, but because they lived in a completely different system their whole life. And people like my parents, they had to find new ways to survive. They had to actually learn new jobs, and I say jobs in quotation mark, because a lot of the times it was selling something. And so maybe you were an engineer, you had an important job, but then you couldn't do that job anymore because there was no job for you in that field, because that field essentially ceased to exist. And so that's another part of this crisis, is that people um were not used to this kind of freedom, because they were not prepared for it properly.
I think we'll return a bit to the outdoor markets because I want to get back to them, but I think I want to get back to them well, whenever you want to come back to them, of course, in what you remember. Lydia, please come back to it. But I mean, in terms of me reading out a quote about the outdoor markets, because I want to set the stage now, because we're still in 1992, about what was going on there. So going into 1992, as you mentioned, there were a lot of very smart people, including in the Soviet elite, but they didn't know how this market economy worked, and they understood, given the way the political system was oriented, there was the president and the parliament, but they hadn't quite yet worked out a new constitution. It was a very modified version of the constitution of the RSFSR from 1978. But Parliament at that time was not called the Duma or the Federal Assembly. It was called the Supreme Soviet still. And what the Supreme Soviet understood, okay, this is an emergency, things just need to be done. If we just sit around here talking, nothing will get done. So we give the president powers to rule by decree for a year. After prices started being freed, another few things about that you have to know about the shock therapy were that shock therapy entailed, as the American economist David Kotz set it out, a set of policies. Liberalization of prices, which we have discussed, macroeconomic stabilization, which meant reduction of government spending to achieve a balanced budget, strict limits on the growth of money and credit. For those of our listeners who do not know, the money supply is dictated by a few things, but the money supply is usually measured in M1 and M2, at least in American textbooks, but that's what I'm working off of from memory. M1 is the sum of all physical money in circulation, so your coins, your banknotes. Obviously, as we move to digitalization, M1 might disappear as a concept or it might evolve. M2, which is actually the more important part of the money supply, is all the different balances in different banks or different enterprises at any one time that anybody can lay claim to. So those monetary resources that are not put out physically, but are nonetheless something that could be realized in that either through transfers into accounts or not. Normally, M2 is not as large as all the possible legal claims on money, but normally you want M2 to be about half of all legal claims on money. So that's what we mean by the money supply. And the money supply in a modern economy is controlled by the central bank, in this case, the Bank of Russia. 3, privatization of state enterprises. 4, abolition of the remaining elements of central allocation of resources. 5, removal of barriers to free international trade and investment. So Yeltsin and his team, led by Gaidar, and obviously with Anatoly Chubais being a constant fixture in top Russian government policymaking circles throughout the 1990s, have the power to rule by decree and set this, and they do to try and implement this. And so what we've described the freeing of prices. So what happened is that to try and balance the budget, they slashed government spending drastically, which further depressed the economy as it removed a source of demand from the economy. So under the Soviet Union, government spending, which is a bit of a problematic concept given that it wasn't like the central government's budget was technically quite low, but given that the government controlled most of the meaningful factories, farms, and means of production, the government didn't really do stuff by spending. It did it through its enterprises, and which were controlled by the Communist Party, and enterprises and firms traded with one another in a planned economy outside the scope of this. But anyway, so you try to replace that with government spending, though, to basically as a source of demand. To balance the budget, these guys hacked away at government spending incessantly, but because tax revenue collapsed, because nobody was getting paid and the economy was contracting, so firms that had been making a profit, and many hadn't been in 1991 in any case, as the Soviet economy was already collapsing then, got even worse. So the deficit remained very high, even though actually they succeeded in cutting it from its 1991 levels in half. The economy fell so rapidly that it remained very, very high. It consolidated at 9.4% of GDP in 1992. So to try and control spending, one of the things they did was they didn't just cut the budget. They actually set very, very low budgets, and then they didn't pay out what they were supposed to set out in their already very low budgets. So how did this work? Well, they either refused to pay people, or because inflation was galloping ahead, they delayed paying people for several months. So whether that be a firm, say, supplying textbooks for schools, or military officers and policemen, they wouldn't be paid for sometimes 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, and then a year late, their salary for when they were supposed to get paid would arrive in the nominal amount that it had been promised then, but because of inflation, it was worth a lot less. And that is how they kept spending low and tried to cut down on inflation. You can begin to see the problem here, because if payday isn't payday, people can't plan, and suddenly money becomes worthless because you don't know when you'll be able to access it. Also, as inflation galloped ahead, the legal claims on money in the economy, so on M2, skyrocketed. So to put this in perspective, consumer prices, David Kotz cites, rose by 520% in the first 3 months of 1992 alone. The money supply, though, so the amount of physical money in bank accounts and among enterprises and anywhere else, so that money supply only rose by 32%. So this meant that actually the value of the money supply had dropped by 80%, meaning that even as there's hyperinflation, a literal shortage of money developed in the Russian economy, which also explains why enterprises couldn't even pay people their much debased wages. They literally didn't have access to the money to do so because the central bank, paradoxically in the situation of hyperinflation, wasn't even printing enough money to make money worth anything, which is part of why enterprises started handing out, to the extent they were still producing anything, part of the produce. What they were producing in an enterprise as a means of people bargaining for anything else that they might be able to get, however they could get it, because they didn't have the money to do so. Now, this might work somewhat, but you can begin to see the problem, because if you're, say, working in a steel mill, what are you supposed to do with rolled steel? If you are working in an office, your office can hand you what? An idea that you've produced? No, this simply isn't going to work. And therefore, people went without salaries, including, of course, very keenly here, law enforcement and police, which meant that police officers at best had to moonlight at other jobs or to spend a lot of their own time actually doing things like hunting for food, or what they often did is they sold their services to criminal gangs, and not even for money, but just to get something to eat because they weren't being paid at their jobs. And this, by the way, wasn't later in the 1990s, albeit that persisted. This was from the beginning of the 1990s. It pretty much started catastrophically bad and got worse from there. By the end of 1992, though, the Supreme Soviet was in revolt because they could see that this was a catastrophe, that everybody was getting hurt. So to put this in perspective, just to give like one little thing about falls in output. So in 1992 compared to 1991, which wasn't a good year, the production of passenger cars declined by 7%. The production of steel contracted by almost 20%. The production of finished petroleum contracted by 1/6. By mineral fertilizer, i.e. to fertilize the soil for agriculture, declined by 20%. It's just an absolute catastrophe, even in 1992, to say nothing of we haven't even started yet with how bad it gets. So they start demanding a greater share in economic policy making because they don't actually know what they want to do, but they know that Yeltsin and his liberals aren't, whatever it is that they're doing, this isn't working and it's hurting a lot of people. Yeltsin doesn't like this at all. He sees this as a challenge to his power, and though he does dismiss Gaidar and bring in Viktor Chernomyrdin as a supposed compromise with the Supreme Soviet, as our trusty source here, Pavel Khlebnikov, cites, Chernomyrdin, even though he was an older man who had made his career, unlike the younger guys, Gaidar and Chubais, in the Soviet system, so he was a well-established member of the Soviet party state elite, that is to say Chernomyrdin, he actually shared a lot of the policy conceits of Gaidar and Chubais, and one of Chernomyrdin's deputies, to summarize what he was thinking going into 1993, was a man by the name of Yevgeny Yassin. And this is what Yevgeny Yassin said to Khlebnikov, because he thought Khlebnikov, being an American, would sympathize with his point of view on this. Yassin said that The Japanese and the Germans after World War II had it easier. Their industry was destroyed. They were living under an occupation regime, and already much had been done to clear the ground and allow them to begin anew. Unfortunately, Russia doesn't find itself in such a situation.
Interesting. Well, I wanted to say, just for our listeners, that this thing that you described with people basically trading with each other and first of all getting paid in whatever it was that their let's call it company for simplicity was producing, that's actually very true, because I remember living through a very lucky time when my dad was paid in apricot, basically canned apricots. Okay. And which wasn't the worst of it, because there were some people who would get paid in like nails and things like that. And so people would trade, or people would try to sell them for cheap and deal with it that way. And so it was a mess in that sense. People who were paid in some type of a food item were at least lucky, even though it wasn't a lot of variety. But then there were a lot of people who were not lucky at all.
Yeah, and so that's the situation that's unfolding. But going into 1993, with the end of rule by decree coming to a head, Yeltsin doesn't want to give up any of his power. But the Supreme Soviet wants to, but a confrontation is being set up. So it looks as though there's going to be a showdown between the president and his parliament in early 1993, but then Yeltsin and the Speaker of the Supreme Soviet, Ruslan Hasbulatov, agree a compromise to hold a referendum in the spring of 1993 about what should be done with the direction of the country. And the entire idea is basically, albeit it's not stated, the essential thing is the essential idea of it was to the Supreme Soviet, still the Duma comes at the end of the year, to find out what would people rather have? Would people rather have a strong presidency, or I'm sorry to use this normative language, a normal democracy where it is the legislature that is the most powerful branch of the government in constitutional terms, not the president. So, as going back to David Kotz here, the battle between President and Parliament came to a head at the December 1992 meeting of the Congress of People's Deputies, part of the Supreme Soviet and the actual working legislative part of it. We don't have time to really go into the structure of the Russian Parliament in 1991 through 1993. It would get very complicated. Suffice it to say that this is the Parliament. It has about 800 deputies in it. With Yeltsin's emergency powers due to expire, the stakes were high. After a measure to transfer authority over to key government appointments from the president to the parliament failed by a single vote, a compromise was struck. The Congress allowed Yeltsin to keep his decree-making powers for the time being, and a popular referendum on constitutional questions, which Yeltsin wanted, was scheduled for April 1993. In exchange, Yeltsin agreed to replace Gaidar by Chernomyrdin. But with no change in economic policy following the cabinet reshuffle and with the continuing decline of Russian industry, relations between president and parliament deteriorated again. In March 1993, Yeltsin suddenly announced a special order of rule that seemed to imply the dissolution of parliament, but he quickly backed away from it in the face of widespread criticism, as well as uncertainty about what the armed forces would do in a confrontation between the president and the parliament. And we will get to what's going on in the Russian army separately when we come to 1994 and the lead up to the war in Chechnya. In response to Yeltsin's action, an emergency session of the parliament met that same month. It removed some of Yeltsin's powers and came within 72 votes of impeaching the president. In the corridor after the failed impeachment vote, Sergei Baburin, a leading nationalist deputy, remarked that the Congress had just committed suicide, a judgment that would be proved right 6 months later. After March 1993, relations between Yeltsin and the parliament deteriorated further. There were disputes over many issues, including foreign policy. Crimea was actually a central question there, and constitutional questions as well as economic policy. The April 1993 referendum, which Yeltsin had originally wanted to deal with constitutional questions, had four questions. 1. Did people have confidence in the president? 2. Did people approve of the socio-economic policies of the president? 3. Did they want early elections for president? 4. Did they want early elections for parliament? Yeltsin seemed to believe the referendum could solve his problem with the parliament. Yeltsin was confident he would win in the referendum. He had a significant power over the media, which, because it was still controlled by the state and people still obeyed the orders of the president, which he used to aggressively campaign for a vote of yes, yes, no, yes, which was made into a jingle that dominated the airwaves. He sought to persuade people that the hardships associated with economic changes were due to the parliament's obstructions of his plans, and that if the stalemate could be broken, the reforms would work. Polls showed that despite a decline over time in Yeltsin's popularity, he still retained significant personal popularity at that time, derived from his leadership battle against the Communist Party and his resistance to the attempted coup of August 1991. The bitterly divided and unruly parliament was decidedly less popular with the public. The results of the referendum were as follows. Confidence in the president, 58.7% to 39.2% who had no confidence. Socioeconomic policies of the president, 53% had confidence, 44.6% of those who voted did not. Early elections for president, 49.5% of those voting wanted early elections for president, 47.1% did not want early elections for president. Early elections for parliament, 67.2% wanted early elections for parliament and 30.1% did not. Yeltsin claimed the results as a victory, but they were not as clear-cut and as he had suggested. While on questions 1 and 2, Yeltsin found strong support in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Yeltsin lost on both questions 1 and 2 in over half of Russia's regions. The referendum showed a public sharply divided in its view of the president and economic policy. What do you remember of the constitutional crisis of 1993 leading up to October 1993?
Well, for obvious reasons, I don't remember much of the events that were leading up to it because I was very little, but I definitely remember what happened later. But overall, and we actually talked about it with my mom a little bit, regions as probably, well, I don't know how many of our listeners actually know about this, but the regions were divided in that sense, because some were more, I guess, in favor of returning to some type of a communist socialist regime, because I feel like a lot of people by that time realized that this was not the way, and so something had to be done. And so there were some governors in some regions, my region actually being one of them, they were not exactly supportive of Yeltsin. But overall, I would say from a regular person point of view, you have to understand that this was a very different situation in some way, from what we are having right now. In what sense? Because people have time to be very invested in political things and really understand the nuance, usually when they have other things under control. Unfortunately, the situation was so bad, especially in the regions, is that a lot of people, mostly what they could do was watch the events unfold because they were busy surviving. And so what I remember is that obviously there was a lot of political talk all the time, and there were a lot of, most of the mainstream newspapers that we had, the popular ones, they were like, from what I remember, they were like 80% politics. That's what it feels like. But overall, people were just very tired. People were just very scared. People didn't really know what to expect. People were stressed all the time. And so in some ways, they were very invested because it was their future. In other ways, they they were not as invested because they were just trying to survive. And so I feel like a lot of those events, especially if you lived in the regions and not, say, in Moscow or St. Petersburg, people people were just watching things unfold because back then we were dealing well, the inflation and the market things we talked about at length, but also some regions had it better than others, but in a lot of regions they were regular, they would turn off the water and electricity, and so that actually added another aspect to the whole survival thing. So, and I feel like in some ways that's actually what enabled Yeltsin.
Well, before we get to framing the events of October 1993, what do you remember of those days, and what do you remember from people who you've later talked to who've talked about October 1993?
Well, I remember just from, from watching my parents and from talking to my mom, what she mentions the most is the feeling of helplessness, because Russia is so big, and obviously those events, if you look at it from sort of, emotionless point, they were very contained in the sense that it was happening in Moscow, and for some Russians, especially back then, it was kind of, a different planet in a way. And so it wasn't as scary militarily, you could say, or from that point of view, but it was very scary because mm, people were afraid, just like they were afraid in the very beginning of the 90s. They were afraid of disintegration, they were afraid of unrest, they were already dealing with a lot of the crime. And so uh seeing tanks on the streets of Moscow, seeing people injured, seeing unrest and not being able to actually do anything about it was very scary. It was very nerve-wracking. Um, and I just, when in general, overall, when I think about the 90s, personally, and when I talk to the people who lived through them, um, a war, a real war, like for example that the people in the Balkans were dealing with, is a very scary thing. But a war also has sometimes a mobilizing effect on the people because you have to actively fight for your survival. You have a mission, you have a goal, you have something that you need to achieve, something that is very characteristic of the 90s. I feel like at least that's how it was where I grew up, is that feeling of kind of gray hopelessness. And just because people were just completely lost. They couldn't understand what was going on. They understood that something very scary was happening, but they were just they they had to think about so many things and worry about so many things, and it was a very dark time in that sense.
Well, for those of our listeners who do not know, what happened in late 1993 is that Yeltsin decided that he'd had enough of the parliament trying to be a parliament, and on 21 September 1993, he issued a decree saying that the parliament was dissolved. This was after he had gradually stripped his president, Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, of powers. On 22 September 1993, in response to Yeltsin decreeing the parliament dissolved, the Supreme Soviet said they had most certainly not been dissolved, only they could decide when to dissolve themselves. And the Supreme Soviet and the Constitutional Court both ruled that what Yeltsin had done was unconstitutional. The Supreme Soviet voted to impeach him, and they swore in Rutskoy as president. And Yeltsin said, well, oh, you want to get me out of here? Just try it. So they both began soliciting for support from the armed forces and the Interior Ministry. Yeltsin had the Interior Ministry, in terms of the loyalty of its top leadership, very much locked down. But and also he had help in that the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, was very much on his side, and actually a then young Sergei Shoigu actually went out into the provinces soliciting for basically armed thugs among local political grandees or whoever was connected to come to Moscow to come and to demonstrate against Parliament and beat up any of its supporters. On Parliament's side, you basically had a very eclectic mix of supporters, most of whom were what they called the Red-Brown Alliance. So supporters of Parliament, or at least the ones who came out in the street, often tended to be communists or extreme nationalists, thus the rather colorful image put out by Parliament's opponents of it being a red-brown alliance. Rather than take the side of the legislative branch, Western governments lined up against the Parliament. Now, here is something that I want to do before we get into what I think was a big part of the reason why, when we talk about Russian liberals, we're not very nice to them. Lydia, in the Soviet times and since, what are the main preoccupations when it comes to liberals and the state? And what do they think the biggest problem with the state is?
Well, I think if you ask the liberals, I don't know if you're looking for a specific answer, but I feel like their biggest concern is always that the state is too controlling, because I feel like to the liberals, and our listeners need to understand that when we say liberals, we mean in a very specific, as in like Russian liberal. It's a specific breed, let's put it this way. There is always this concern that the government is too controlling and wants all the power, and there is not enough democracy. That's the general attitude, I feel like.
Okay, well, here is the thing. So Yeltsin is supported by Russia's liberals in moving against the parliament, which is the legislative branch that people have voted for. So the liberals in this case are supporting executive power against legislative power, but they say that the state has too much control. So I wanted to read out two quotes here. One is from a book by a American, I guess you could say, like security security professional, and Dale Herspring, about the Russian army. And so for those of you who do not know, Dmitry Volkogonov was a senior general in the Soviet army who also wrote history books. And because he had access to the archives and he started writing under Glasnost, and he started discovering some less than pretty things about Soviet history, he wrote these big expose biographies about how terrible Lenin and Stalin were, and about how, abuse of power was such a bane in Russia's history. So one of the senior politicians in the Supreme Soviet on 3 October called Volkogonov to plead with him, to try and plead with his fellow generals to not send the army against the parliament. And this is what Volkogonov, according to Herspring, said to Voronin. Yeltsin was the country's president. He had issued a lawful order in writing, and that the army would carry it out. End of story. The military's job was to neutralize opposition in the White House, i.e., the Parliament building, a task it carried out successfully in a relatively short amount of time. The actual arrest of those who had seized the White House was left to the country's security services. Rutskoy and Khasbulatov, as well as Generals Achalov and Makashov, were arrested and sent to Lefortovo prison. This was during the crackdown. So, Mr. Liberal General, the biggest problem with state authority is when he's being called and having someone please do something to persuade them not to crush Parliament. He's like, ha 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 ha, eat you know what.
Yeah, but and this has to be said that Yeltsin. I mean, it's no surprise to anyone that the longer he stayed in power, the more his popularity declined. But he was not very popular even back then. I guess, it's not surprising to a lot of people, but I have to throw it out there because even back then there was a lot of satire aimed at him. And like I mentioned, those newspapers that we had, they were filled with satire on all of our politicians. And then the longer Yeltsin stayed in power, basically, from what I remember, that pretty soon after that, he started his embarrassing things that he did, and so which didn't make people like him anymore than they already did.
Um, the other thing that I think, although I can't find the quote, is from Natalia Novodvorskaya, who was a prominent liberal dissident in during the whole during the late Soviet period, and she said that she wished she could have had a gun and been there on 4 October 1993 in order to shoot a lot of the supporters of Parliament herself, and that it was necessary to kill a lot of them to purge a lot of what was wrong with Russia. So these are just two examples of the reactions of Russian liberals, and the political class most closely associated with Russian liberalism, so Chubais, Gaidar, etc., all lined up behind Yeltsin in sending army tanks into Moscow and shelling parliament. At least 187 people were killed in the so-called October Crisis, but it's likely that it was actually more. So Yeltsin shells Parliament and destroy and has a burned out husk. Um, and it is celebrated in the West as a blow for democracy.
Well, I guess that's one way to look at it. But I'm saying this very ironically, obviously, because I don't think that Russians, especially back then, they already got their taste of democracy, and seeing something like that in the streets of their capital didn't exactly scream anything positive to them.
Yeah, I think that that is quite interesting that you note that because it it's afterwards that things politically start to go wrong for Yeltsin, and he starts to lose a lot of its popularity. So I found the quote from Novodvorskaya. So with your permission, I'm going to read it out in full. It's quite frightening. So this is what she wrote. On the night of 4 October, we had a choice, to kill or to die. We preferred to kill and even found moral satisfaction in it. On the morning of 4 October, the volleys of the tank guns broke the sky blue silence, and we caught each sound with pleasure. And if during the night they had given tanks to us, Democrats and humanists, nobody would have hesitated. The White House wouldn't have survived till morning. Not even ruins would have remained of it. I regret only one thing, that some people left the White House alive. We are not dealing with people, with equal opponents, but with some evil black fog. To deal with it, we need bullets. You don't count the enemy's losses in battle. They died at our hands, at the hands of the intellectuals who had consciously and forever abandoned the flag of doomed pacifism and powerless humanism. I know that 20% of my fellow citizens regularly vote for communists, fascists, Zhirinovsky, and simple filth, and I am completely prepared to get rid of every fifth person. I am no longer afraid of Pinochet. I am prepared to use any methods to win this civil war.
Well, I think this quote is actually very telling because it made me think that that's a lot of the attitude that we have in the present day. I think that it's very interesting because even though the events are very different, but you can see a lot of the same attitudes because just like today, the modern liberals, Russian liberals, they refuse to accept that the majority of people want something that is different from what they want. And they condescendingly call those people, in Russian, they call them like the gray mass, or they say that we have a hive mind. And when in reality, uh, the society back then wanted certain things, wanted order, wanted peace. And actually, I read an article from one of our political experts, and he mentioned that in his opinion, the events of 1993, they created this distrust in the people and in the government, and that actually took quite a long time to overcome. And one could argue that people, in some ways, still haven't overcome it, because the people wanted something very different from what I guess let's call them the liberals wanted. And yes, that was definitely the beginning of the real decline in Yeltsin's popularity.
Yes, because what Yeltsin then did was he and his team of top liberals who'd always been worried about excessive executive power and the state having too much authority wrote basically the present constitution of the Russian Federation, where the president is very, very powerful. He can appoint the cabinet and he can appoint the prime minister. The Duma technically can, but if they refuse the president's nominee for prime minister 3 times, it is the president who can dissolve the Duma and call new elections. But this doesn't mean that the president himself is up for election. So basically, the Duma exists at the sufferance of the president per the Constitution. Under President Putin, it doesn't quite work that way, but we'll get to why next time we have an episode on the 1990s. But suffice it to say that that's the Constitution that they write. So it's December 1993. It's just 2 months after that they have written this new Constitution, dissolved the previous parliament by fire, and the largest party to get seats in the Duma, albeit far from a majority, is the so-called Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which, as anybody knows, is neither liberal nor democratic nor really a party. It was kind of until he died in 2020, early 2022, a Vladimir Zhirinovsky fan club. And all you need to know about Vladimir Zhirinovsky is this: he was an outrageously, horrifically anti-Semitic man who was also Jewish and known to be Jewish. It's what we call here in Britain not the LDPR itself, but we have here in Britain a party called the Monster Raving Loony Party, and I think the LDPR is kind of Russia's equivalent of the Monster Raving Loony Party, but you're never quite sure if all of them are fully insane or if some of them are about to break down in their act and start guffawing with laughter.
Yes, because actually, even though, and you don't have to agree with me on this one, but now as an adult, when I listen to some of the stuff that Zhirinovsky said when he was in his more serious moods, he was a smart man and he actually had a lot of really good takes, in my opinion, especially when it comes to Ukraine. However, it is very true that back then, if we're talking about a regular Russian perspective, like I mentioned several times, the political satire that was prevalent. Because something also I want to say that by the time, we're talking 93, 94, even though things were definitely still horrible, but people get used to everything. especially if they're Russian people, they get used to things even quicker. And so by that time, I feel like people came to terms that we're free and democratic, and so we have to somehow survive. So I remember those by that time, it became less turbulent. So not to confuse with better, but just less turbulent. And the way how people dealt with a lot of their frustration with the government was through humor. And so the way that the Liberal Party was viewed, and Zhirinovsky in particular, is that he was there for, comedic relief in a sense. And I remember from those times, they would show a lot of the, sessions that the politicians had, and it was a mess. And people would argue, people would scream, people would do all kinds of things. And so most people didn't really particularly take him as a serious politician, at least, in these places around here.
It's also important to say about that election that the party put together by Gaidar, which was meant to be Yeltsin's party of support in the Duma. Yeltsin never joined the party, never really associated with the party, was a party headed by Gaidar and Chernomyrdin called Russia's choice, that later morphed into Our Home is Russia, or Our House is Russia, Nash Dom Россия, however you want to translate that. It came second in the vote totals, and behind it, barely behind Our Choice is Russia / Russia's Choice, because they're a rebranding of the same entity, was the Reborn Communist Party, led by that permanent fixture up to this point in Russian politics, Gennady Zyuganov. And although the LDPR was at that time the largest party in the Duma, they pretty quickly just basically supported whatever the Kremlin said while heavily criticizing the Kremlin, and it was the Communist Party which emerged as the main opposition to Yeltsin. Before I get into some of the anecdotes and tragedies further on, what do you remember as you talk about the situation stabilizing, but that doesn't mean that it's getting any better or even ceasing to be getting worse? Just the predictability of how much bad and how downward the trajectory is setting in. What do you remember of about 1994?
Well, like I said, things stabilized. People understood that there was no going back. And so by that time, most of the people were able to get used to the new reality and find jobs. Like I mentioned before, my parents had to had to work in different fields, let's put it this way. Most people I know worked in what was called back then commerce, which essentially there were a lot of shops, stores, kiosks, so people were selling things. And there was, because as you probably know, the 90s were the time when Russia suffered from major brain drain. And so a lot of the people who were more qualified and young, I guess, and more adventurous, they were able to leave Russia. And a lot of the people, they had to sort of, find different occupations. Uh, Also, a lot of the things that were not normal when the 90s started, they became normal, which were not nice things. For example, crime was rampant. And I remember, hmm, well, another sad thing, which also, I guess we didn't really talk about, but it's a natural thing, and a lot of people like to talk about it because I guess that's where the stereotype of a drunk Russian stems from. A lot of people started drinking because Russia had major alcohol and major drug problem, because people were so depressed, and a lot of people didn't have any desire to live or the means to live. And even if they somehow managed to get used to the new reality, that stabilized on some level, that reality was not particularly one that they enjoyed. And so that's something that you could see. For example, um, I'm not going to say that obviously nobody drinks in Russia, but just anecdotally, in my circle of friends, most people either don't drink at all or only drink on holidays and very moderately. Back then, that was not the case. You could see a lot of people drinking heavily, unfortunately. And you can also see a lot of homelessness, or at least, even if it wasn't homelessness in the Western sense, where people actually didn't have homes, you could see a lot of people that maybe they did have a home, but they were drunk, and so most of the time during the day they were just wandering around and looking for things, and that was all very normal. And also there was the general feeling that settled in is that even though people individually made a lot of effort in creating this normalcy for themselves, feeling of normal life, overall there was this feeling of the government not really caring on this basic everyday level, meaning that there was garbage on the streets. There was, a lot of, like, if you went to a park, a lot of the benches were broken. And so things like that, they became the new norm. And we kind of we settled into this new Russia, whatever it was.
Okay. We've been going for about an hour, and I think we had planned to actually cover all of Yeltsin's first term, but I don't think we will because there's just so much to talk about in terms of a cataclysm. So, I was instead going to ask a different question to perhaps close up. From what you remember, from what those you know remember, which is that it is often said that in this time great new freedoms were being introduced. How free did you feel?
Ah, there let's put it this way. I don't want to paint it all in dark colors. Because even when I talk to my mom, who I've mentioned enough times on this podcast, hi mom. Um, people how do I put it? Uh, there were some good things. People were enjoying some aspects of it, because obviously not everything was perfect in the Soviet Union. And so people were enjoying the variety. People were enjoying some of the freedom, the media, because that's when we got hit with the Western media really hard in the 90s. They were enjoying some of those, you could say more Western things. Those were nice. I guess back, looking back, during the Soviet Union times, I guess people just didn't expect that they would come at such a cost. That's how I can summarize it.
But in terms of politicians and the politics in your region, would you say that the politicians became more concerned about the people?
I particularly can't speak about that aspect, because if you ask me and how I assess it, and also how those around me assessed it, is that people kind of felt very separate from the state. I can say that during this time, living in Russia right now, I can see that people have a relationship with their government, in the sense that they feel that they can affect some things. If they don't like something, they know whom to write, they know what to do. We have activists, and back then it kind of felt like the government, in the sense, was somewhat separate from the people, if it makes sense. So the government existed in some type of a different space. And then there were regular people who were just trying to survive. They were deciding on the big course. They were fighting with each other. They were doing some things locally and on the federal level. And then there was the everyday person level. I guess to some extent, and I remember my dad talking about it, some of it felt nice, because A lot of people didn't particularly enjoy too much attention from the government that they maybe received during the Soviet times. But also, the feeling of abandonment wasn't good.
So, what did Yeltsin in 1994? He's gotten everything, and he's therefore suddenly at the summit of his power. But here's the strange thing: this, I think, by the way, would characterize Yeltsin. Herspring certainly characterizes Yeltsin this way, which is that Yeltsin was very capable of smashing down obstacles in his way. When the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was an obstacle in his way, he worked hard to smash that down. When Gorbachev was an obstacle in his way, he worked to smash that down. When the parliament was what he thought was an obstacle in his way to securing his power, and this was all about Yeltsin's power, he smashed that down. When there was nothing more in his way, he didn't know what to do, and he retreated into his study and started at best reading, at most drinking a lot more, and often not even really working. What were your impressions from when you were really were really quite young of President Yeltsin? So in this early period, 1992 to 1994.
Well, I can say that initially, what I felt and what I gathered is that people never really had a lot of trust in him. This is my opinion, and I guess, this is more in retrospect, but I think that Russians overall enjoy a very particular kind of a leader, which, by the way, in my opinion, Putin really fits. Um, but Yeltsin never was that. Because Russians overall, they enjoy someone who is more reserved and who is more, I guess, not so much out for, for his own interests, obviously, but at large, I feel like most people saw him as someone who used every opportunity to get ahead, but was ultimately only concerned with himself and not the country. And as you know, Russians are very much, I guess that's where the hive mind comes in, because I guess we do have a hive mind in that sense, but not in a negative sense. Russians are very community minded and very much they respect someone who is able to make sacrifices for the greater good, and Yeltsin never was that. And I feel like, at least around here, like I've made that disclaimer many times, he is not someone who had a lot of respect. And then, once he started drinking, and we're kind of, getting a little bit further on the timeline, he lost whatever respect the people had because I guess, as we wrap it up to kind of, we'll leave it for another episode, but I guess one more thing that I would like to stress is that the 90s were a difficult time for Russians, not just because of all the economic things and other events that were happening, but also because people lost their sense of purpose, but not just on a personal level, but also on a country level as a nation. Because imagine being this great power, which for all its faults was very much respected, and people still needed to, that was the USSR was a power. And then we became a country, free and democratic, but not as respected. And so when you have a president who gives you that feeling that he's not concerned with the well-being of the country and then starts drinking and behaving very embarrassingly, that was a very huge blow to the people's pride because they felt that they were humiliated, and this time they were not just humiliated inside their country, but they were also humiliated on the international level.
And dealing with the humiliations of not even being paid.
Yes,
And
there was a lot of humiliation. Any way you look at it, it was a very difficult time, which explains, the problems that we had.
yes, indeed, Yeltsin was, after all, a very uncorrupt, unproblematic figure. So, Lydia, before I get into this story, do you happen to remember two men by the name of Vladimir Gusinsky and Boris Berezovsky?
Yes, because they were kind of very famous, or I should say infamous, during that time. So they were actually in the news a lot, and kind of in the news a lot, but also in the background a lot, because there were politicians and there were oligarchs or businessmen, as people would mostly call them. I actually think that the term oligarch that we use these days very often, it kind of we started using it a little bit later, but back then it was mostly businessmen.
So, these two businessmen in 1994 hated each other. They absolutely hated each other because both started coming up about the same time in 1991, 1992, with first reselling commodities and then trying to take over the car dealership business. In Berezovsky's case, through a vehicle called Logovaz, while Gusinski also had other business interests because Moscow, for the first 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, was a scene of gangland warfare that meant that the murder rate exploded to near or even beyond Brazil's levels in those days, as two factions in purely gang terms, the Slavic gangs and the Caucasus gangs, mostly dominated by Chechens, fought for control. The gangs were both trying to get territory and economic assets to enrich themselves, and some gangsters became businessmen or oligarchs, but often oligarchs were hiring or patronizing gangs or giving them a cut of their business deals in return for protection and also attacking their rivals. So, where a gang ended, where a private security firm began, and where a legitimate business began, nobody could quite say. And I don't think that you could fully unpack that even if you tried. It all kind of melded together. But these two businessmen, Gusinski and Berezovsky, both sought political influence and political protection. In Gusinski's case, it was with Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov. In the case with Berezovsky, it was with the Russian president Boris Yeltsin, our hero, your lovely first president, Lydia. Berezovsky got into favor with Yeltsin by getting in good with Yeltsin's bodyguard chief, General Borzhakov, and also he got in well with Yeltsin's daughter, principally by helping her out with a number of business deals, and she took a personal liking to Berezovsky. Not in that sense, don't get me wrong. It was just a lot more in a personal sense that she found him a very agreeable to do business with. And Gusinski, by getting in with Lushkov, was getting in with Lushkov because not only was Moscow the one area of Russia that was actually experiencing any economic growth in the 1990s, not very much. It was very, very marginal. But the fact that it wasn't an absolute disaster zone made Moscow a relatively secure and nice place in Russia in the 1990s, to the extent there was one, and there really weren't, even Moscow. But Moscow was a place where if you worked for the city government, you weren't paid much, but at least you were actually paid. You still got to keep your social housing, provided that you weren't murdered by gangsters or property developers or businesses who were often one and the same people trying to take your apartment. So Lushkov actually ran a more or less straightforward city government, and it actually collected a lot more in rents from businesses than Yeltsin's federal government did on all of the federal government land holdings in Russia. And when you think about how huge Russia is and the very valuable land that the Russian government had access to, this tells you how awfully managed the Russian government was under Yeltsin and the liberals, and also that therefore Lushkov looked a lot better next to Yeltsin, and Yeltsin understood this and resented it, even though Lushkov was outwardly loyal to him but also subtly critical of him. So a way that Berezovsky wanted to get at Gusinski was not just for business, but because he held Gusinski responsible for, in 1993, trying to blow him up with a car bomb. Whether Gusinski did or not, that's very difficult to say. We don't have all the facts of the case. it could have been Berezovsky just pointing the finger at one of his business rivals when any number of people would have wanted Berezovsky dead. However, having gotten in good with Yeltsin's daughter, with President Yeltsin himself, by buying up the rights to publish Yeltsin's autobiography and then essentially overpaying Yeltsin for the sales, Berezovsky had in effect handed Yeltsin a bribe, and in such a way that Yeltsin could just say, oh, it's through book sales, and maybe even he didn't want to know too much about just how Berezovsky was passing him the money so that he, i.e. Yeltsin, could continue to look good. Suffice it to say that Yeltsin's daughter also didn't like Gusinsky because his motorcade, when he went to work every day, Gusinsky that is, into Moscow, often passed by a route used by Yeltsin's daughter. Yeltsin didn't like Gusinsky because of this fact, and also because Gusinsky was linked to Luzhkov, and Berezovsky was able to seize on this and play up on it, on how Gusinsky was a threat to Yeltsin's daughter, and also the fact that because Gusinsky had a television station that was outside of control of the government in any direct way, that is, that therefore he represented a threat to the president's power because of sometimes critical reporting of the Yeltsin administration on Gusinsky's television station ORT. So what did Yeltsin do? Well, Yeltsin ordered his bodyguard unit in unmarked cars but fully uniformed up to chase Gusinsky out of his compound on a high-speed chase from the suburbs into downtown Moscow to Gusinsky's corporate headquarters, then besiege the building, terrorize his bodyguards and his chauffeurs, to and including threatening them with weapons, threatening them with hand grenades, beating them up, kicking them literally when they were down. In one case, one of Yeltsin's security men kicked one of Gusinsky's bodyguards in the groin. Gusinsky pleaded for help, not knowing who was coming after him. As I said, where the line between business, private security force, the government, as we mentioned, police were often moonlighting for gangs or for private security firms, where all of that started and melded together, nobody quite knew. So he didn't know that just because some guys were turning up very well organized and in uniform, that they represented the government, as opposed to perhaps just being hired government thugs. And indeed, indirectly, they were, of Berezovsky against him, but also used by the president just against a guy that he didn't like because he was inconveniencing his daughter a little bit. Gusinsky, in a panic, also called the local FSB office and begged for help. And the FSB did come to try and help, but then when they got told who they were dealing with, they too went away. And so eventually Gusinsky and his guards had to surrender. Now, mostly this was a scare for Gusinsky. He was soon out, and not just of jail, he was very soon out of Russia and went away for 3 months after this, which took place on 3 December 1994, in an episode called Faces in the Snow, at least in the media parlance of the time. But what it also signified is just how much the state had been captured, personalized, and privatized under Yeltsin, and how it didn't really kind of meaningfully exist. And that's just one example of crime and corruption in the 1990s. But Lydia, do you remember anything of this episode or other such episodes from when you were younger?
Oh boy, do I remember. Well, I'm not going to talk about the kind of, we could say higher level crime that people talked about back then, but just on the everyday person level, there was definitely a lot of crime. And that's actually something that I feel like happened very early on when the 90s hit us, is that there was a lot of homelessness, and which I've mentioned before, and also there was a lot of crime. Like apartment robberies were very, very common. For example, these days, living in Russia, I actually can't remember the last time when I genuinely felt unsafe, either on the streets or in my own house. Just things like that. I mean, they do happen. I'm not going to try to paint Russia as this, heaven. on Earth. But definitely it's not the norm. Back then, it was the norm, which is I feel like one of the signs of the times in the 90s was that people started putting bars on their windows, especially if you live on the lower floors, like first floor, ground floor, or second floor. Basically, when there is a chance someone climbing into your apartment. Also, another sign of the time, along with the bars on the windows, which was unseen during the Soviet times, were metal doors, like heavy metal doors. And a little bit later on, late 90s, early 2000s, they became prettier, and sometimes you can't even tell exactly that it's in, like a reinforced door. But back then they were kind of, they didn't look very pretty, but they were sturdy enough. Because you had to protect your home. That was the reality. Also, there was a lot of robbery on the streets. That was a little bit later, this particular memory, but still, when I was in school, for example, and a little bit older, which is why I remember. Obviously, when girls get a little bit older, they start wearing earrings, for example, simple gold earrings, or because it was the 90s and a lot of us, didn't have a lot of money, so girls especially, they would wear like those big fur hats that they got from their moms, and they would warn us in school that if our classes end late, that we should be careful, because for example, there were some cases in my city where people would get robbed on the street. Like they would have like their earrings ripped out of their ears. They would have their fur coats or fur hats or anything that looked somewhat valuable and looked like it could be resold. They would get robbed, basically. So that was a risk. There was also a lot of uh, pickpocketing back then, which is also, again, happens, I guess, in Russia, but definitely not as common these days. There was definitely a lot more violence, because like you mentioned, there were a lot of gangs, and so in a lot of areas there were a lot of those, we could say lower level gangsters. They lived in the area, and so usually they had places like cafes that they favored, that they would go to often, and so the locals usually knew that if you didn't want any trouble, probably wasn't a good idea to show up at a certain place. There was also a lot of drug problem if we're talking about crime, meaning that not only we already talked about how people were unfortunately drinking and using drugs trying to deal with the new reality, but also obviously um, there were people who were dealing drugs and other substances, and that was also very common. And so basically there were a lot of things happening, a lot of violence, and generally wasn't there was a feeling of unsafety when you were in the city, especially if you lived in the bigger city, because I feel like, just like it happens everywhere, I feel like when there is a smaller town, people tend to stick together more, but in bigger cities, people mostly tried to survive, and it showed.
I think on that note, we'll wrap up for the moment, but we'll be coming back to this subject. And next time, we will be dealing with when things start to turn. Oh, no, of course, I'm joking. When things actually get worse, because we've left off in December 1994, and that very month, Yeltsin was scheming, against the advice actually of most of the military high command, to launch the first war in Chechnya. And we'll be getting to what that was all about next time. We will also be getting to the honest way that Anatoly Chubais dealt with privatizations, which ensured that accountability, transparency, the rule of law were established. I'm kidding. Of course not. We're going to be talking about loans for shares and other privatization scams. And Then the re-election of President Yeltsin, which established the democratic practice of ballot stuffing and stealing the election with the complicity of the United States and the oligarchy that Yeltsin himself had helped create, in part through these corrupt privatization schemes. So, you thought things were bad now? Don't worry, they get worse. They do get worse. We'll talk about it next time, though.